Good morning. I'm so pleased to be here with you today. The work I'm going to present, the paper I'm going to present to you today arises in part from this, a little bit of promotion, this recent publication. The history of quilts I will sketch here today encompasses global trade and the building of empires, the transformation of domestic life, and the rise of the first industrial trade, which was the cotton trade, with the first factory-made cottons. Quilts are emblematic of the major changes that shaped Western societies over the past 500 years, and my talk today traces some of these developments, some, of course, not all, or we'd be here a lot longer. The quilts themselves mirror geopolitical events, social hierarchies, and changing gendered material practice. This bedding also illustrates how men and women reshaped their environments, working to add new comforts, shaping the shifting commercial and cultural practices that enveloped them. Western Europe was at the cusp of great changes around 1600 when this talk begins. Some of these were already evident, such as the surge in trade that followed direct oceanic contact with Asia. Other changes were still in gestation, slowly manifested in the years that unfolded. The results of these changes could be seen in the growing prosperity that marked parts of Europe, not to mention the greater commercial activity in parts of Asia, as manufacturing and mercantile systems responded to the rising demand for their goods. So overall, we can say that Europe experienced a slow transition from scarcity. However, scarcity remained an underlying reality that we need to keep in mind, surging to the fore during the whole time that I'm talking about, at times of high food prices, war, epidemic disease, or severe weather. These harsh facts of life determined attitudes towards the new material innovations that were about to take place, setting the terms for the reception of new commodities. Now I'm going to turn at this point to consider Indian textiles and their first reception in Europe. We'll begin by trying to imagine, it takes a little imagination for those of us here, trying to imagine a society without cotton quilts. It requires a great leap of imagination to a time when dearth was commonplace and comforts were few. The stark dwellings of the common people in the 1500s offered few physical consolations. Bedding in Europe was rudimentary, confined to coverings regionally available made of down, wool, linen, animal skins, and occasionally, very occasionally, silk. The wealthy and powerful slept warmly, or relatively warmly, and the poor and middling folk made what they could of their goods, often using woolen cloaks indoors for warmth. The scant information about quilts from the medieval era suggests their rarity in Europe as a whole. There we go. Love this map. In contrast, Asia's wealth of textiles had drawn adventurers for centuries, as you see here in a system showing the system of interlocking trading zones from the 16th century. Most famous was the Silk Road, and silk quilts of several kinds are mentioned in medieval European documents, most frequently in regions adjacent to Eurasian trade routes, such as the Eastern Mediterranean. So, in this part of the world. But Indian cottons had pulled merchants to the subcontinent as well, and for many hundreds of years. However, it was only after 1500, when European mariners found a direct sea route to the Indian Ocean, that all manner of textiles flowed back into Europe in growing volumes. India had a vibrant quilt culture long before Portuguese ships first arrived at the subcontinent in 1498. Quilting in these regions had an ancient history, and these textile creations were renowned and traded widely in parts of Asia. This early trade, then, and Europe's reception to Asian fabrics is part of a critical global dynamic. And gradually, more Europeans were introduced to a growing range of consumer goods after 1500, and these goods were superior to anything Europe had to offer. This occasioned what has been called a transmission of culture through trade. ultimately bringing Indian quilts within European circles. Over time, a vibrant style of bed furnishing became a key cultural idiom in the West. From this perspective, we can see quilts as emblematic of long-run transformational processes whereby Western society slowly moved from material scarcity to relative plenty. The rise of quilt culture in the West brings us in touch with profound changes that altered the experiences of daily life for generations. Now, Indian cottons, including quilts, set new standards for what some term the new luxury in early modern Europe. And this new luxury is quite distinct from old luxury beloved by monarchs and aristocrats, typified by goods such as jewelry and ermine robes associated with inherited position and fixed hierarchy. As Jan de Vries observes, the new luxury is generated by urban society striving for more comfort and pleasure, a luxury that lent itself to multiplication and diffusion. The new luxury consumer goods possess traits that encourage the ready adoption by diverse social groups and communities. Thus, the 16th century European travelers to the subcontinent found vibrant textile markets, the like of which they had never seen before, and they wrote of the goods they discovered. An Italian adventurer journeying through Asia in the early 1500s described Bengal as having, in his words, greater abundance of cotton than any country in the world. In neighboring Burma, he observed, the good beds of cotton covered with silk or cotton on which people slept. A century later, a French writer showed the same enthusiasm for India's manufactures, noting the articles imported into Europe, including quilts stuffed with cotton, painted and patterned exceeding prettily. Others are bespangled and painted with various figures. The Frenchman recounted the articles then being imported, pillows and counterpanes, he wrote, all cleverly worked. He was certainly acquainted with Indian quilts at this time, as they were becoming celebrated commodities in Europe by 1600. In short, wrote this Frenchman, I could never make an end of telling such a variety of manufactures, for they are all cunning folk and owe nothing to the people of the West. Thus, the goods made by Indian artisans intrigued first a handful of Europeans and then thousands, as the tide of Asian commerce swept into Lisbon, Antwerp, Paris, London, and Stockholm over the 1500s and 1600s, reaching the wider areas of the Atlantic world as well. At this stage, I'm going to turn now to a key pivotal category of quilts, Indo-Portuguese quilts. The quilts shipped from India took different forms over the centuries, and the first types of coverlets were distinctive in many ways. What came to be called Indo-Portuguese quilts recorded on their surface the first generation of European voyagers to Asia, offering a series of snapshots of cross-cultural interactions. These elaborately embroidered bed covers offered extraordinary visual depictions, mnemonics of military, cultural, and commercial relations. These were carried back to Europe and integrated into existing collections of domestic furnishings, bringing a new iconic form to the beds and couches of Europe's elite. Indian artisans adapted patterns with those from Bengal or Gujarat, stitching composite images of Europeans hunting, waging war, sailing ships, combining these images with regional iconography. In some cases, these coverlets included dynastic crests provided by European traders or intermediaries interpreted by Indian artisans. And if you look at the center of this first quilt I showed you, you see the family crest of a Portuguese family. The charm of these bed covers encouraged an exchange of embroidery motifs between Portugal and the Indian subcontinent, and even the migration of skilled embroiderers to Portugal, at least on one occasion, to instruct local artisans in this form. In a recent book on dress in the Renaissance, which I highly recommend, written by Julinka Rublak, she explores the intense interest in the representation of clothing among 16th century elites and middle classes, a highly politicized subject during the era of Reformation and assorted imperial contests. Interest in dress produced a new genre of book, with printed figurative illustrations. Readers were fascinated with these depictions, comparing social practices, measuring themselves in terms of masculine valor and appropriate luxury. And Rublak observes that some European artists looked outwards to construct these comparisons. For example, in the case of one of these books, based on a voyage to India about 1508, commemorated in a series of woodcuts. I think we can better understand the positive response among Europeans to the Indo-Portuguese quilts by placing them within this wider fascination with figurative imagery in Europe overall. Of course, one of the great differences between the European volumes on dress and the embroidered quilts is the nationality of the artisans. It's clear, however, that these quilts highlighted themes European men wished to celebrate, including family lineage, mercantile exploits, Christian symbolism, and male gallantry. In fact, we can determine the ideals and the priorities of the male travelers to Asia by analyzing the designs of these early quilts. The ethos of European adventurers is illustrated in the stitchery. Tomé Pérez, for example, listed the notable features of those people he encountered on his eastward journey. Pérez was a Portuguese court apothecary, so a trained and educated man, sent to Asia by the Portuguese crown as a representative, later an ambassador, and he recounted the qualities he most admired in the regions he visited. In 1512, he observed that the Portuguese Gulf port of Hormuz was full of warlike, civilized, and domestic men, while the men of the Deccan region of India were celebrated as warriors and gallant by nature. Pérez esteemed traits of masculinity familiar from his homeland that he encountered in Asia. R.W. Connell describes the predominant features of early modern European masculinity as privileging military performance, family connection, and honor. And as we look at these Indo-Portuguese quilts, all of these themes are depicted. Some bed covers, such as the one here, show great ships surrounded by fish and monsters from Hindu legends. Many feature hunting scenes along the border, an elite masculine enterprise with deep social significance in all Eurasian cultures as expressions of virile bravery and fierce dexterity. These coverlets grace the beds and couches of Europe's political and commercial elites, a cross-cultural celebration of early modern patriarchal ideals. So, this is perhaps one of the reasons that accounts for the success of this unique form. These quilts carried powerful, iconic imagery, I think in some ways akin to military banners carried into war or to great naval pennants hung from ships' mastheads. Imperial and commercial ventures are suggested in the images depicted in these textiles. The military culture of this era in Europe, whether on land or on sea, involved systems of symbolic transmission through the use of textiles in flags, in pennants, in banners, and other fabric devices, infused with potent meanings to rally and command men, such as you see here in these two paintings from this period. Religious banners are similarly infused with spiritual and customary authority employed in ceremonies or preserved as markers of notable events. Cloth standards with a multiplicity of designs were highly charged with dynastic, religious, institutional, and national associations steeped in the male-led campaigns of this age. And I think it intriguing to have a look at this painting and see the ways in which the cloth standards fly overhead of all of the melee going on below. Now, obviously, quilts are not direct parts of these institutional ceremonies or practices, such as with highly ritualized flag etiquette, for example. But these objects were created and used within this cultural context. And the embroidered Indian bed covers mirrored the ambitions of the men driving their nation's military and mercantile agendas. The quilt motifs signaled priorities and celebrated achievements, parts of a communicative language of objects that characterized these global trading ventures, transmitting the geopolitical goals of this generation. The embroidered imagery celebrated imperial ambitions and commercial aspirations, further encouraging the production and distribution of quilts from east to west. Western ships sail along wide borders with flags flapping, accompanied by smaller Indian Ocean dhows and mythic sea creatures, charting the newcomer's arrival in the southern seas. Other related quilts on silk or cotton use chain stitch embroidery that creates the effect of quilting, with the heavier stitches generating a more vivid pictorial style. Great. I love this quilt. My heart stopped the first time I saw it, and I was hoping it would be very big. The Museum of Fine Arts in Boston holds exceptional examples of such cleverlets, including one with a breathtaking depiction in the center panel of an artillery assault between two contending forces. Are they both European forces? Are they European-Indian? I don't know. But muskets and artillery are deployed, military banners are held aloft, and the dead or wounded are flung bleeding on the flower-strewn ground. Let's see if we can find a bleeder. He's a bleeder, and if you look closely, it's not quite sharp enough. You can see the sort of spurts of blood. I'm just gobsmacked by this one. The borders are also filled with action. Men are on the hunt, spears ready, dogs growling, deer and boar fleeing, birds preening, the whole linear progress entwined with the more characteristic flowering vines and enveloped by leafy branches typical of the decorative forms of this part of the world. Is the military encounter based on a painting or actual event? I don't know. Thierry Nicolas Tashloff has studied Indo-Portuguese quilts in French collections held in Paris, Bordeaux, and the Indian Ocean island of La Réunion, finding striking examples of the genre. One coverlet appears to memorialize a victory or perhaps a treaty between former combatants, in this case depicting Western and Asiatic fighting forces. And a later coverlet, in this case not embroidered but painted and printed in a similar style from about 1650, commemorates a diplomatic embassy with the meeting of Dutch East India Company and Golconda officials in central India. In sum, these quilts narrated dreamscapes of empire, of wealth, of preferment. Portuguese and Spanish merchants and other nobles acquired these coverlets with alacrity over the 1500s. Noted collectors like Antonio Perez, who was Secretary of State for the Spanish King Philip II, included 8 quilts among his immense ornamental and artistic assemblage. 2 it's thought might be Indo-Portuguese, the rest from various other sorts. Now, I mention Perez not only because he owned quilts, but because he was a trendsetter in Iberian society with an influence that extended throughout the courts of Europe. The later 16th century inventories from the stadholder, that is the head of the government of the Netherlands, also included what were listed as couverture de España, that is Spanish coverlets, evidence of the spreading Iberian fashion. But by this time, a wider array of quilts is also beginning to arrive in European markets, not embroidered in silk such as here, but printed and painted cottons or embroidered on cottons in floral designs. About 1600, both the English and the Dutch began competing with Portugal for Asian trade through the establishment of their individual East India companies. First the English East India Company and then the Dutch East India Company. The growing craze for quilts was evident almost immediately in the auction prices in London, where from £5 to £40 were spent by some enthusiasts on individual quilts. And just to give you an idea of the actual amount of money they're investing in these goods, £50 could comfortably support a middle-ranked family for a year. So there was a fashion for quilts. Even calico quilts that were described by the auctioneer as somewhat defective and stained were bought without qualm, so keen were English buyers. Whether Bengali monochrome quilt or the more colorful, appliqued and embroidered sorts, these coverlets became a vogue among generations of consumers. And they also crossed the Atlantic. Indian embroidered quilts, called colcha by the Spanish, were indispensable in the homes of wealthy Iberian colonists from the 16th century onwards in the New World, long before quilts assumed importance in North American colonies. I'm going to turn now to the practice of the domestication of quilting and the spread of quilt culture more generally. As I've mentioned, India produced a variety of quilts which found growing markets over the course of the 1600s. At the same time, there is a synchronicity of events. At the same time, during the 17th and 18th century, European houses were changing in their structures. Sleeping quarters, such as is depicted here in one of many Dutch paintings of domestic interiors, sleeping quarters were being awarded greater space and greater designated space. In other words, people weren't just sleeping in the Great Hall, or there weren't just beds and kitchens by the fireplace, but designated sleeping spaces. And a greater investment in housing was being made by elite and middle-ranked families. So the settings for sleep were in transition. For newly wealthy merchants and traders, as well as for gentry and nobles, new house designs that included corridors with rooms off corridors as opposed to walking immediately through rooms. New house designs allowed for greater privacy, with designated rooms for sleeping, beds, bedding, and domestic decor that became more elaborate. These new areas of the home were shaped at least in part by trade with Asia. I think that might be a quilt on that bed there, but this is definitely a quilt here. These rooms were being shaped at least in part by trade in Asia through the incorporation of quilts, painted cotton bed hangings, painted cotton wall coverings, curtaining, cushions, and the like. This is an amazing bedroom from a dollhouse held at the Rijksmuseum from about 1675. This long-run transformation represented an important commercial opportunity for the new trading companies that I've mentioned, both the English and the Dutch. And company employees working for the English East India Company struggled to secure stocks of quilts to keep up with demand, looking to various parts of the subcontinent, often in competition with other European and Asian agents also searching out quilts. A letter dispatched to London from Ahmedabad in 1618 noted the writer's valiant efforts to acquire, in his words, quilts party-colored according to your order, but he complained, "We cannot get tailors enough to work." In higher spirits later in the year, the employee announced that he'd found a supply of quilts in another region. In his words, all of one kind of chintz, such as either side might be used. He also noted another variety he'd acquire, most used in India, and we think will be most pleasing in England. Thus, international commerce brought the comfort of quilts to the bedrooms of Europe, first to the elites, and then to the respectable, enterprising middle classes whose numbers are growing over this period. Quilts from England provided uniquely crafted physical pleasures, functional as well as a canvas for visual display. The botanic motifs in particular resonated in Europe, still largely a rural society with a robust floral culture shared by elite and common peoples. The designs attracted as well as inspired, and imports of quilts grew. For example, 19 bales of quilts arrived on one vessel, the African, in 1664. while 4 East India Company ships arriving in the summer of 1685 included 2,400 quilts among their cargo. In the last 3 years of the 1600s, nearly 3,400 quilts arrived in London warehouses from India, fit for beds and cradles, along with thousands and thousands of yards of quilted calico ready to be cut to measure and trimmed. European needleworkers, both amateur and professional, began working on these goods themselves and reinterpreting the Indian quilt, crafting their own variations of this hybrid form. So as the 18th century opened, cotton quilts were familiar domestic accessories in many parts of this northwest region, northwest Europe. Distinct in comfort, beauty, and practicality, they were one of a growing inventory of the new luxuries I mentioned, luxuries that women cared for in the home. A midwifery treatise written about 1700 includes instructions for preparing a bed for childbirth. What was the best for a woman's bed? Why a quilt, which for functional reasons was far preferable to wool blankets, and this was the instruction given by the male author of this midwifery treatise. And it's interesting to note that the picture that I'm showing you here is actually of a lying-in room. That is a room that was prepared for the birth of a baby, and that great mound of textiles on that woman's lap, there's actually a baby doll in there. That's the new baby, and there's the mother lying in bed, covered by her quilt. European housewives learned what their Indian counterparts already knew, that Indian cottons washed well and the colors remained brilliant after repeated washing. Cotton bedding offered greater potential hygiene at a time when white and light-colored linens were culturally associated with cleanliness, as cleanliness was being reconceived in this era, and when laundering was being given greater emphasis throughout Northern Europe. And again, I show you an image of a Dutch housewife working on her linens. The Dutch in particular epitomized this reverence for clean linen in bedding, throughout the house and on one's person. Weekday rituals of washing and laundering were a hallmark of Dutch life in this period. Indeed, Dutch housewives were described as perfect slaves to cleanliness, but where they led, others followed. Tomás Maldonado and John Cullers note that the ideology of comfort appears closely involved with at least 2 parallel categories, hygiene and order. And we can see the Dutch right at the forefront of this. Practicality and aesthetic concerns coincided perfectly in this quilted cotton bedding, whether for a woman in labor, a newborn babe, or the routine bedclothes for family and friends. Calico quilts brought a unique dimension to domestic furnishings. Consider the consolation offered a guest, perhaps concerned about the rigors of travel about 1700. In a letter written about this time, the host reassured the traveler, "Your bed shall be made as easy as it can be made by putting a feather bed under the quilt." Sandwiched between quilt and feather mattress, this visiting kin could rest at ease. Inspired by Indian imports, Europe's needlewomen expressed their own understanding of global trade and hybrid Eurasian designs, crafting their own versions of these quilts. Collectively, these women over generations absorbed the motifs that they saw and translated these versions of Indian designs into their versions of domestic furnishing, blending exoticism and domestication in equal measure. Their needlework speaks in part to their understandings of these global imperial ventures. The process of inspiration, adaptation, and recreation generated Western forms, sometimes with straight copying, other times with regional styles, such as you see here on the left-hand side with the Portuguese Castelo Branco embroidered quilt. a style, the Portuguese Castelo Brancos became renowned in that part of the Iberian Peninsula. During the 16th and 17th centuries, generations of European women acted as cultural mediators through the use of their needles. Their projects were collective, discursive, and generative, showing what Anne Rosalind Jones and Peter Stallybrass describe as links to the larger world of culture and politics. So when you see these embroideries, you need to think again about what it says to us about these global connections at this period in time. By 1700 then, quilts had become part of the household vernacular in the Northern Atlantic world and exemplified the attention given to comfort, an important new ethos spreading through the social classes. John Crowley observes that physical comfort, a self-conscious satisfaction with the relationship between one's body and its immediate physical environment, was an innovative aspect of Anglo-American culture at this time. Now, I would suggest that increased attention to comfort was not unique to English-speaking regions, but was rather a feature more generally at work within Northwest Europe and the Atlantic colonies. A research team assessed the material environments of 2 English counties between 1600 and 1750, and the results of their findings were that, as I've already mentioned, houses gradually improved. They had more rooms and more specialization in rooms. In the wealthier county of Kent, in the eastern region of England, there was also a marked increase in bedding along with beds per household. This model of material ownership matched other parts of Northwest Europe, further proof of the evolution underway. And again, another doll's house that I just love. I might become a doll's house aficionado, but it shows the beautiful example and representation of calico quilting in mid-century. We need to remind ourselves, take ourselves out of the 21st century and try to put ourselves back into an earlier time. We need to remind ourselves of the singular sensual experience provided by this new style of bedding. Not simply a visually enhanced sleeping space, although it was certainly that, but warmer, lighter, washable bedding, and I emphasize the washable, that was increasingly affordable. Women were uniquely connected to this transformation. Laboring women at this time, so not the wealthy, but the ordinary working women, worked longer hours, it has been found, to augment their family incomes because they aspired to participate in consumer markets and to own new goods for both style and utility. Women also cared for greater quantities of textiles in common and middle-ranked homes. The flood of cottons brought new demotic embellishments to these domestic settings, offering a greater aesthetic delight and bodily ease. We can find other evidence of the diffusion of quilt culture as well in legal records and in English wills. These confirm how widely owned quilts became. Now, if we sift through the records of London's largest and busiest court, the Old Bailey, there's ample evidence of Indian calico quilts owned from the 1680s to the 1720s. And you might be wondering, why would anyone look at criminal courts to find out who's owning calico quilts? Well, there's a simple reason for this. Textiles and clothing are the most commonly stolen commodities at this time, and ordinary people don't leave wills with inventories. So if you want to know what ordinary people owned and how this may change over time, then you can turn to legal records and get, well, you can get a view. Some of these early quilts were valued at several pounds, while other more pedestrian coverlets were much cheaper. Price and quality varied for all quilts, but by now thousands of quilts were being made in homes and in workshops in London, Amsterdam, London, or Paris. Now, you may be surprised to know that a ban was instituted against Indian cottons throughout most of Europe by almost all, with the exception of the Dutch, all the rest of Europe by about the 1720s. This was an effort to protect local textile trades. but authorities failed to constrain the changing dynamic in material culture underway within Europe. The Atlantic colonies were not subject to this ban. But most Europeans did not renounce cotton entirely, and others turned to local substitutes as European artisans worked to replicate Indian cottons, producing facsimiles in linen cotton blends. And at the same time, quilts and quilt culture spread ever more widely throughout society. At this stage in my talk, I'm going to turn to one of the last points, which is the further democratization of quilting and the rise of the patchwork quilt. And it's all to do with cotton. Calico, chintz, and even Indian quilts appear sporadically in court records throughout the 1720s and 1730s, even though there had been supposedly an absolute prohibition of almost all cottons in England in 1721. Owners of these calico quilts that we found in the Old Bailey court records, owners of these calico quilts ranged widely socially from numerous lodging housekeepers in London to an 18th century general. In other words, a cross-section of Londoners. One quilt owner comes to us from 1746. Mary White was a widow, living in lodgings near Somerset House in central London, and in her words, she lost the bedclothes all off my bed. Mary White had a seeming hand-to-mouth existence. She supported herself doing plain needlework to make ends meet. This would not be a lavish lifestyle. But her life was not devoid of small pleasures, even what we might see as new luxuries. Along with a pair of blankets that she also owned a quilt, valued at 10.5 shillings, with a distinctive calico cover. Was it an Indian calico? I can't know. If so, it was 20 years old, but even at that age, the printed colors would be vibrant, but it could also have been one of the new British-made linen cotton calicos, substitutes for the Indian originals. Whatever the truth, the list of her bedclothes hints at the pleasures of simple luxuries for people even like Mary White. Women like Mary White supported themselves with their needle, and quilting was one of the many needle trades followed by these women. Shops and specialist warehouses sold these quilted wares, with one London warehouse owner announcing that his goods were, quote, quilted under his immediate inspection. Many women earned their living at quilting, some with exceptionally fine stitching and others with the routine speed of long running stitches that was the hallmark of the ready-made trade. This example illustrates another regional effort at interpreting and replicating Indian quilt designs, and this comes to us, as you see, from Germany, well, what's now Germany. The craft of quilting took commercial and domestic forms. At the same time, European entrepreneurs struggled to replicate Indian cottons, achieving growing success in the second half of the 18th century. By the 1760s, records for Britain show that the principal medium for quilts was once again cotton, or described as cotton, British cotton this time, or a cotton-linen blend. The British cotton industry expanded dramatically during this time period, the 1760s and the 1770s, employing new technologies of production. As you all know, the Industrial Revolution began in Britain, and the Industrial Revolution began with cotton. Thus, the spread of quilt culture in the West is intertwined with two great global events. First, direct oceanic trade between Europe and Asia, and second, the birth of industrialization. The result of the latter was a flood of textiles across the Atlantic world at unparalleled prices. The patchwork quilt exemplifies the next stage in Western quilt history, the last stage I'll discuss here, another landmark in the diffusion and naturalization of quilts throughout Western society. The flowering of cotton patchwork quilts accelerated from the late 1700s through the next century, with female energies shaping the flood of factory-made cottons. Industrialization directed this process. Patches might come from worn garments, but women could also buy packs of off-cut cotton scraps for pennies. Patchwork sold by weight was advertised on both sides of the Atlantic. An industrious seamstress could transform these remnants. Patches were socially complex emblems, defining frugality, prudence, and economy. Raggedness was to be avoided at all costs, if possible. The patch was an acknowledgement of the inevitable trials of family life and the duty of a wife to be prepared. Gendered injunctions to thrift and industry animated the use of patches. Evidence of deft needlework and the careful use of resources was the hallmark of the good housewife. It was generally agreed that for females, as one 18th century author wrote, the art of economy and household managery was the most proper for their sex. The patch epitomized the discipline demanded of women of all ages, and even the least able seamstress could cobble together squares of fabric to form a patchwork. The least able perhaps might characterize the quilt on the right-hand side, but I have to say I love that little cradle quilt, and especially the evidence of long wear and long use. But inspiration and invention could also play a part in the making of patchwork. Women worked within the constraints of thrift, refiguring patches in complex ways that challenged simple notions of plenty or want, styling discarded or used fabric into newly attractive objects that modeled ingenuity and skill in equal measure. Cotton was critical as the essential democratic textile, signaling both utility and fashion in its folds. Cotton patchwork represented the virtues of the industrial age, negotiating the balance between comfort and charm. I've come now to my conclusion. Quilts are commonly imbued with family histories of creation and use. However, cotton quilts also exemplify global economic and social change, as cotton textiles spread from Asia and the Eastern Mediterranean to Northern Europe and beyond. Their cultural force reconfigured domestic settings and provided a vital new medium for gendered expressions of skill and talent. Laurel Ulrich reminds us that the history of textiles is fundamentally a story about international commerce in goods and ideas. Indian embroidered quilts began this long process, the quilts evolving in concert with wider changes. The early Indo-Portuguese coverlets mirrored priorities of state, military, and patriarchy. Quilts holding less martial associations superseded these early coverlets. Women embraced the quilt as a new form of comfort, shaping the decorative designs in keeping with their priorities and their resources. By 1800, factory-made cotton cloth was the essential medium of quilt production. Quilt culture came to the West as a result of broad global processes. Quilt culture evolved throughout the West through the wider forces of change that followed. Scarcity gave way before a rising abundance, gradually redefining domestic comforts in the Atlantic world. Patchwork quilts are the offspring of this rich history of cross-cultural trade. Over centuries, comfort, culture, and community were redefined through the spread of the cotton quilt. Thank you.